Good evening. Thank you very much for coming tonight to this event. Can I remind you please to switch off your mobile phones? And when we get to the question and answers, can you please speak directly into this microphone to make sure that our online audience can hear you? So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce the panel tonight. James Meek, who's a writer and author of The People's Act of Love. He was a Guardian journalist in Moscow during the 1990s, or in the former USSR. And he'll be chairing tonight's discussion. Also, I've been asked to say, Luke's book is on sale here for only £10, so snap up a copy tonight. I'd just like to say a few words, though, about Andrei Soldatov, who was flown here thanks to our Frontline Russia project. He's a Russian investigative journalist, and Frontline Russia screens films across the country. That is Russia, from Moscow to Chelyabinsk. We do about 2 screenings a week there, and so we thank them very much for the partnership we have. So I hope you enjoy tonight's event, and I hand over to James.
Thank you very much. Welcome to the Frontline Club. It's a great honour to be here with these 4 distinguished colleagues. It's a very long time since I reported from Russia, and my departure coincided with a complete transformation. When I left in 1999, Putin was nobody. He was just another grey politician who seemed likely to be a prime minister for a short time, and then somebody else would take over. And then suddenly he's prime minister, he's president, and Yeltsin's gone, and it's as if the entire country was transformed. And a few years after that, Luke Harding was the recipient of the experience of that. Yes, we have this excellent panel here. Luke Harding, the Guardian's Moscow correspondent, previously the Guardian's South Asia correspondent, reported from the paper from Afghanistan and Iraq. I seem to remember always being there, and you arrive into the same hotel room. He's author of Mafia State, How One Reporter Became an Enemy of the Brutal New Russia, and co-author of WikiLeaks, about the Julian Assange story. Angus Roxburgh, on my right here, author, journalist, Sunday Times Moscow correspondent in the mid-1980s, BBC's Moscow correspondent in the Yeltsin years, author of the Second Russian Revolution, Pravda, Inside the Soviet Press Machine. And I think it's fair to say there might be a few questions tonight about being inside the Soviet press machine, or the Russian press machine, perhaps, as you actually were quite recently. So you had a chance to sort of see the world from inside the Kremlin. And most recently, you're working on a new book at the moment, I think.
That's right. Book and 4-part BBC television series, Putin, Russia and the West.
Andrei Soldatov, remarkable man who has written a remarkable book. Without trying to take away from Luke's sales tonight, I commend to you Andrei Soldatov's The New Nobility, one of the remarkable pieces of work which, in spite of everything, manages to come out of Russia, the inside story by a Russian about Russia. And Susan Richards, non-executive director and founder of Open Democracy, specialist on Russian affairs, the author of Epics of Everyday Life, about the lives of ordinary Russians in the transition from communism, and Lost and Found in Russia, Encounters in the Deep Heartland, which covers the period 1992 to 2008, so very much about that transformation, almost a kind of psychic transformation, perhaps, of people. Really, this all comes down to, this all goes back to the reason for this event is Luke's book, Mafia State, and your experiences, your strange experiences. I mean, you must have expected, when you moved to Russia, that you would at some point come up against the face of authority, a line which you crossed, somebody saying you can't do that, you've got the wrong papers, but I guess you didn't expect it to appear inside your own house in the way that it did.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, when I arrived in Moscow in January of 2007, and I had no conception that I would end up writing a book about Russia that was not the plan. But the problem was that, as James says, within about 4 months of my arrival, two of my colleagues in London, Ian Cobain principally, met Boris Berezovsky, the kind of renegade tycoon who's now doing this colourful legal battle in the High Court with Roman Abramovich. And Berezovsky is something of a kind of ranting figure, and he told them he was plotting and financing a revolution against Vladimir Putin. So we, The Guardian, ran this on the front page the next day under that headline, "I'm plotting a Russian revolution." And my job was to phone Angus's friend, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's press secretary, and get a quote, which I did. I think a more secure regime would have ignored these rantings from someone who'd been in exile. But the Putin regime, despite everything, I don't think is a very secure regime. And really, the day after this article was published, the sky kind of fell in on my head. And what I mean by that was that someone started checking my emails, strange people came around to the flat. I was summoned by the FSB to go and be interrogated in Lefortovo, which is this totally creepy KGB prison which Solzhenitsyn writes about, where Alexander Litvinenko spent 8 months before he ran away to the UK. And suddenly, by which I mean my wife, our 2 small kids, we found ourselves plunged into this rather surreal kind of Cold War drama. I mean, for anyone who's seen Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, it was a bit like that. I mean, not the 70s collars and the sepia or Colin Firth, but the kind of mood of kind of psychological enmity towards me. And really the worst aspect of this, of suddenly being this sort of suspicion falling upon us, were these, what the Americans call these house intrusions. Basically, a gang of FSB agents whom I never met and never saw broke regularly into our Moscow apartment. First of all, where we lived in Voikovskaya in northwest Moscow, and then when we lived in a small, rather lovely cottage in Sokol. And instead of nicking stuff, which is what your average burglar does, and taking your TV, they did all sorts of strange psychological things. They opened the window of my son's bedroom when we lived on the 10th floor, and there was a massive drop below. We'd locked the window. They set alarm clocks, which went off in the middle of the night. I mean, at one point they left a sex manual or a book on relationships next to my bed, which had been bookmarked to a page on how to have orgasms properly. So I look at this curious book in Russian, next to my kind of middle-class London novels, and you're sort of thinking, well, I mean, it was awful and amusing at the same time, and we're thinking, well, are they watching? Am I doing it wrong? Is my technique lacking in some respect? And it was funny, but it was also terrible. And what I spent a lot of time doing was to try and work out. I mean, partly this book is a quest. It's a sort of thriller. It starts with this dramatic break-in, and it's trying to kind of work out who are the guys who break into my flat. But also, more than that, it's an attempt to say, what has happened to Russia 2 decades after the end of communism, and to try and give a kind of portrait of this kind of dark state. And the restoration, the unambiguous restoration under Putin of KGB methods and KGB thinking, and this sort of classic authoritarian model that we'll talk about later on. But just to fast forward, this didn't stop. I mean, the British Embassy told me, yeah, we know about this, happens to us, to our diplomats, we have this many cases similarly. When I read the WikiLeaks files, I discovered that the Americans were also privately moaning back to Washington about it, talking about unprecedented levels of harassment from the Russian security services, and talking about house intrusions, which is what they call them, becoming bolder and more commonplace. And this briefly culminated, this kind of unhappy thing culminated with my being kicked out in February this year and deported for entirely fictitious reasons. And it was at that point, sitting in a deportation cell in Domodedovo airport, surrounded by a bunch of friendly Central Asian guys who were playing cards. It was that point that I realized that, the FSB, this vast, prodigiously resourced organization, it is actually quite dumb, because by deporting me, of course, they made it inevitable that I'd write a book, and there were as always, they were tactical but never strategic. I mean, these guys are like terrible chess players who can only look one move ahead.
And what was the effect on your family of this continuous psychological warfare? Because these break-ins, it wasn't like the classic moment in the film when you come back and you see the place ransacked. It was this thing where you think, presumably, for a moment, wait a minute, I didn't do that, or did I put that there, or that.
Well, I mean, the thing is, first of all, just to be clear, it is obvious. It's not, you don't have to be it's not like losing your car keys or anything like that. I mean, that's just kind of silly. I mean, it's kind of real, it's crude, and to begin with, it's quite spooky. And then later on, you kind of get to live with it. But as a family, we kind of had to, well, first of all, we didn't tell the kids about it, but we had to sort of change our routine, because basically the British Embassy said correctly that like all correspondents, we were now bugged. There was no point in, trying to get around that. So Phoebe, my wife, and I, we would wander to the bottom of our little garden in the snow and talk under the plum tree. For a while, we kind of communicated using sort of cartoon felt tip pens, which we're advised to do, which you then sort of flash down the loo. But that got really tedious, so we stopped doing that. And in the end, actually, it became a kind of, it was kind of humorous warfare. I mean, we hung a clock with Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev next to our front door as a kind of greeting. So the first thing our FSB visitors would see was, oh, it's Vladimir Putin, so they could maybe kind of bow before kind of carrying on to do whatever it is they'd been instructed to do. And the sex book was a great thing at dinner parties. We would sort of pass it around and everyone would laugh and we would sort of point to the ceiling. So we tried to use humor, but I mean, that didn't take away from the kind of underlying menace, but I think it was important not to kind of give in and show that the bullies had won.
Andrei, what do you think Luke's experience has to say about the way that the Kremlin has and if we can talk about the Kremlin here, because it's very much a question which we might talk about the relationship between the Kremlin and the FSB, but the authorities, shall we say, the Russian authorities, what their attitude is towards journalists, both foreign and Russian.
Well, I have been covering the Russian secret services for 11 years, and so I can trace how the tactics of the FSB changed for these years. And I have to say that maybe the crucial change happened in the year 2000, when it was decided that the Second Chechen War should be fought on different rules, and it was decided that it should be someone to blame in the failure during the First Chechen War, and it was journalists. So this time the FSB and the Kremlin decided to change the rules.
This was the First Chechen War from 1994 to 1998. Six, when it was perceived that the Russians had lost, the Chechens won,
mostly because
they blamed the media.
Yeah, they blamed the media. So that's why they decided to do in a different way in 1999, 2000, and 2001. And in 2002, the chief of the counterintelligence department at the FSB, Nikolai Volobuyev, stated openly that now they expelled thousands of foreign journalists for so-called illegal journalistic activities, and thousands had their visas revoked, just dismissed. And after that, they understood that these tactics might be very effective, because many journalists, foreign journalists, understood that if you have Russia as your specialization, and you risk your profession if you write something very critical, and so maybe they need to think twice what to publish or not to publish. In 2007, I had a joint investigation with the Danish colleagues and the Danish Broadcasting Corporation. And I asked them, how can I mention them in my story when I worked in Novaya Gazeta, so I needed to write something. And they told me that, can I not mention their names? Because they openly told me that they needed Russian visa in the next year. So you see, this kind of self-censorship might work. And what I think is important in the case of Luke, that actually the FSB didn't present the reason. And in this case, nobody knows why Luke was expelled. Because of Ingushetia coverage, because of the North Caucasian, because of Berezovsky, because of WikiLeaks. So people are left in the situation to guess. And nobody knows the line. So all journalists now, in Russian and foreign journalists for these 10 years, they're just guessing what might be the line, what is acceptable and is not acceptable.
But when in the United States certain commentators accuse the media of having lost the Vietnam War, they meant the American media, not foreign correspondents. I mean, you're talking about foreign correspondents. My own memory was that it was the coverage by Russian media that really made trouble for...
Yeah, you know that in 2000 many things happened with the Russian media, and most of papers were put under control of the Kremlin. The TV is now completely controlled by the Kremlin, and we have only one radio station ostensibly free, but it's owned by Gazprom Media, so it's very difficult to say that it's completely free. And we have just some few websites that might be free, but the problem for these websites, they have no money to send people to, for example, to the North Caucasus. And some people, for example, Anna Polikovskaya was killed, and to be frank, if you are talking about censorship, it was very effective. It was not just a sign or signal to the media. It was effective because it prevented us to get information from Chechnya. Because now nobody knows and nobody can understand what's going on there. And nobody can compare the situation in 2010, for example, with the situation in 2009. People just say, well, Kadyrov is an evil, and that's all. There is no details. So that's why we have these tactics applied to foreign and Russian journalists. But the tactics might be different.
Angus, you had the experience yourself of being thrown out.
Yes.
But that was thrown out of the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union in
so
1989.
Give us a comparison of expulsion
Well, this was when
techniques.
I'd been the Sunday Times correspondent for a couple of years. 1989, under Gorbachev, when everybody thought that that sort of thing was no longer going to happen. But reading Luke's book and your description of your expulsion just brought it all flooding back to me, because clearly the techniques that the FSB use today are exactly the same as those that they used against me back then. They didn't harass me all the way through my time there as a correspondent, but in 1989 Margaret Thatcher expelled 11 Russian spies from London, and the Russians retaliated in their usual fashion by picking 11 diplomats and journalists to expel, including me. And it was after that that the harassment began with me. They followed me. I started jotting down the numbers of cars that were following me, and I spotted that there were 4 beige Ladas following me everywhere during the 2 weeks. If I shook one of them off, another one would appear from around a corner. They invested a huge amount of labour into this just to find out where I was going. When we had friends visiting and would see them out to the metro station, there were guys taking photographs of them from across the road. On one occasion I went to visit a friend in the afternoon. It was pouring with rain, I remember, when I left his flat. I went out to get into my car, and of course there was a flat tyre, which I had to change in the pouring rain, watched by these 2 men in a beige Lada 20 metres down the road, just watching me getting soaked. And then the most horrible, frightening incident was when I'd gone very late at night to visit a friend who was a member of the Soviet Parliament, and somebody on very good terms with Shevardnadze, who was then the foreign minister, and with Gorbachev himself, hoping that maybe he could put a word in for me and get the decision reversed. And when I was driving home, it must have been 1 o'clock in the morning, up Leninsky Prospect, big, wide, empty avenue, I saw these 2 characters sort of appearing on the empty road ahead of me, and I thought, what's going on there? I sort of slowed down a little bit. And they were clearly positioning themselves in front of my car, and as I got closer I saw that they were both wielding champagne bottles and were coming to smash my windscreen, and I had to swerve around them. I never had such a frightening experience. My hands were frozen on the wheel. So same thing, and also same excuses for the expulsion. I think you mentioned in your book that they accused you of violating travel regulations.
That was one.
Yeah. Same with me. We had gone in 1988, a whole year before I was expelled. My wife and I and our 2-year-old son had gone for a few days in Yalta. Richard Branson had bought the Orianda Hotel in Yalta, and we'd gone down to do a travel story for the Sunday Times. And on the second day, when we came back from the beach, I was called in by somebody from the Ukrainian KGB and told that I had violated such and such a article of the Ukrainian administrative code or whatever, and we were bundled onto a plane straight back to Moscow that night. And when it came to expel me, that was one of the things that they produced as proof that I had been spying.
Snap.
Susan, reading Luke's book is quite a depressing experience. It's a catalogue of sadness, really. But that you have a perhaps not a different view, but a deeper view, a richer view of the whole sort of journalistic scene in Russia, and perhaps it's not entirely as bleak as it may appear.
Yes, I think I've had a much nicer time than Luke, and it's left me with a view of Russia and its potential for change, which is, I think, more promising than I'd have had if I'd just read your book without having had my experience. And I just sort of like to say a few words about what my experience was and why it's left me with something very different. Because what I've been doing I've written 2 books since 1988 about the experience of ordinary people of the traumatic changes since of the collapse of and its aftermath. The first thing I'd like to say is that people did tremendously believe in democracy in those early years, but they didn't know what it was at all. They were entirely conditioned, as you two would know very well, by the need, what they'd been inculcated by political obedience and the danger of taking initiatives, i.e. the very opposite things that you need in order to make a democracy flourish. And when the changes came, we in the West didn't do anything to help them with the huge change in consciousness that would have been needed for those events to go any differently. What we were after, and we got, was the opening of the markets. When Yeltsin's economic team privatized 70% of Russia's assets and gave them to a sort of handful of insiders, that well, it suited us, but it did absolutely dish the chances of democracy. Hyperinflation destroyed people's lives, reducing 40% of the country to the poverty line. And in short order, ordinary Russians saw their own president making war on the Russian people in Chechnya, stealing, with the help of the oligarchs, an election, and Clinton congratulating him on his triumph in defeating the communists like that. By the end of the 90s, no wonder they were delighted to get, by the prospect of stability, chaos, being the end of chaos. And of course, rising oil prices soon cemented that by making them feel, that now they were not just going to get stability, but prosperity. So, but that was then. That's quite a time ago. It's a sort of decade ago now, and things have changed. Anybody who knows about Russia knows that there's a sort of demographic catastrophe going on there. That people are dying, men average age of 59, and the generation that's coming into the workforce now is one that hasn't got that Soviet conditioning. And for all there's nothing, absolutely nothing incorrect about what Luke says about the facts of this mafia state, but the consciousness of the Russian people is changing very fast now. For instance, 43% of Russians would see democracy as more important than order now. That's a big change. And they don't see the West as the enemy. This is, the Levada Center polls, which show that they don't see the West as the enemy. And funnily enough, 43% of Russians now see the end of the Cold War as their victory, not our victory. They don't cast things in these Cold War terms. And what's more, although Putin's now sort of guaranteed himself a almost indefinite future in office, the attitudes to Putin have changed enormously. The absolute adoration of Putin has now changed to deep cynicism. And we're moving into a period which is much more like the Brezhnev period in its sort of feeling. And people's heads aren't trapped the way they were underneath the sort of bell jar of Soviet censorship. I mean, the internet is more or less, it's more or less free. People travel abroad. 50% of professionals are leaking out of the country, taking jobs all over the world. They are part of our world. And if Russia is going to get the modernization that its economy needs, it's going to have to change. And we don't yet have the evidence for this, but I believe that those people have learned the lesson that their parents didn't have, which is that democracy is not something that is bestowed on you, a sort of magical event, that it's something that you actually have to get out and work for. And it's much harder than learning how to ride a bicycle. And so this is, yes, it involves an act of faith on my part, but underpinned by a lot of facts. And so it's left me much more hopeful about the future.
Well, it's good to have that sort of slightly balancing optimism. But it is a bleak picture you paint, and you back it up with a lot of bleak facts. I'm very interested in this idea of the relationship between the FSB, the successor to the KGB, and the state, and indeed, what is the state? Who is in charge in Russia? I mean, reading your book, and this is something that has been very much my impression on my visits to Russia in recent years, is that the FSB has been given enormous power and resources. On the one hand, it's been given direct money by the state, but it's also its people who've been put into positions of power. But then there's the question of what are these people after? It sometimes seems as if it's still in that kind of transitional state that it fell into in the 1990s, when people were just trying to make money as fast as they could and never knowing when the tap was going to be switched off and it was all going to come to an end. So what's your feeling, having gone through this experience, about is the FSB under somebody's control, or is it the FSB who runs the country, or does anyone really run Russia?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Before I answer that, I just want to say that my book is not a kind of tale of gloom. I mean, it's partly elegiac. I mean, it's partly a love letter to our children, and it's partly kind of just trying to recreate this world from which I'm kind of currently excluded, at least while Mr. Putin is there. And there's a lot of color, and there's a lot about the challenge of learning Russian and the joy of reading Russian literature in the original, of discovering Bunin and Dublatov, for example, emigre Soviet writers of the 60s and 70s. So while the general sweep, I think it's true to say, is pessimistic, there is brightness there too. But in answer to your question, your question is a very good question. I remember sitting after, I'd been booted out, and then I was let back in briefly on a single entry visa in February of this year, sitting in Dom Knigi in northern Moscow with Olga Krishtanovskaya, who's, like Andrei, is one of the sort of foremost experts on Russian elites in the FSB. We were sitting there over a cup of coffee, and it was an interesting encounter, because after about 10 minutes, a guy in one of those cheap grey suits with brown shoes sat 2 meters away from us, and my heart sank, and I looked at Olga, and she said, "Duh." But I said to her, Olga, so who controls the FSB? Is it Putin? Is it Medvedev? Is it nobody? And she just said, no, that's also secret. So I mean, no one quite knows. But I think the broader point is one of the conclusions I come to in my book is, in a sense, you can criticize Putin for very many things, but I think his biggest failing is intellectual, that he's actually failed to come up with a kind of new national idea, if you like. It's not about communism anymore. It's not about ideology. It's not about world socialism. So while he's on this sort of self-conceived historical mission to make Russia a great power, a kind of a maximal power, regional player, and so on. I mean, he has a kind of idea, but there's no sort of driving concept to it. And in this vacuum, what do we have? We just have this stonking kleptocracy. I mean, the corruption story in Russia, I think, is the biggest corruption story in the world. I mean, it's the world's biggest exporter of oil and gas. And we know the people at the top of the Russian state, some of whom have official salaries of 10, 15,000 dollars a year are millionaires, in some cases billionaires. I mean, it's no secret. Just look at the Forbes list. Look at Putin's friends and how much money they have. And I do think Russia has kind of metastasized into this vast kleptocracy. The Americans, we know from WikiLeaks, think the same thing, more or less. And the problem is that the FSB, it has this mission, this kind of xenophobic kind of mission, which is the legacy of the Soviet period, which is to kind of smite the enemies of the state, whether they're human rights activists or troublesome journalists like me, or everyone around here, or Russia's rather feeble liberal politicians. But its primary goal is about making money, about raiding businesses, about self-enrichment, and getting hold of assets, offshoring them, and guaranteeing for you and your kind of personal surrounding, for your personal family, a degree of comfort. But this system is no good for anybody, because even the people who are making money, I think, are now despairing at Putin's return and are kind of profoundly depressed. I don't think they believe that Russia's got a great future. And this all comes from Putin. I mean, basically, he's kind of retreated into his comfort zone, and he's got this vast FSB, this vast authoritarian state, and he doesn't know what to do with it.
But you think he has got it?
Well, I think he sets the tone. I mean, how much he kind of micromanages, how much he implements stuff. I don't know, but the corruption stems from him, because the more corrupt bureaucrats you have, the more you can guarantee loyalty. And as Susan says, when people are thinking for themselves, and there's a new generation coming up, and people no longer kind of buy what they see on state-run TV, which is basically for zombies, there's going to be more discontent. But I think the problem is that Putin is the only guy who can glue this system together, and without him it would collapse. And it's clear that the badminton-playing Medvedev can't do it, right? I mean, he can't even play badminton very well. So some people say, I think quite persuasively, that Putin would like to step down and spend time with his girlfriend in Sochi, just relax. But the logic of the system is he has to carry on and on and on, like Brezhnev,
James,
until they carry him out.
Can I just pick up on the corruption thing? One thing that struck me strongly when I was researching the corruption part of my book was how the same names, the same figures pop up all over the place. Many of them were Putin's friends from his days in St. Petersburg 20 years ago, with whom he created a so-called dacha cooperative, which is basically a sort of private village of country houses. His friends from those days are now major figures in the media, in banking, in Gazprom Media. They swap assets around, they sell bits of the media from one to the other. It's the same names that pop up all over the place. So they've got everything in their control. And whether or not your friend Stanislav Bielkowski claims that Putin has a fortune of 40 billion or whatever.
Sure, I mean...
one senior Russian businessman now in exile gave this opinion to me. Putin doesn't need 40 billion anywhere, because like a sort of mafia boss, he can get anything he wants. He's got all these friends in the right places. He can have a private yacht or a private jet at the snap of his fingers, and doesn't actually need all that. He controls it rather than having the money himself. But I mean, frankly, it's all guesswork, isn't it?
Andrei, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on who controls who. Is there a state in Russia that the scale of FSB control over themselves? Is it a solid, integral organization? I mean, there is the impression sometimes that that almost is an attempt to create a new aristocracy in Russia, and that rather than, you can't have big estates anymore, so you have sort of virtual estates instead.
So the idea was to create a new elite group, and mostly they failed, as Luke said, because they failed to produce... Mostly failed because they tried to produce new idea, and actually they managed to produce only idea of serving. We need to serve the state, we need to serve the regime, no matter what kind of regime. So that's why now they see themselves as successor of Cheka, of Bolshevik secret police, and at the same time the successors of Akhrana, as the Tsarist secret police. So I just can't imagine how it can happen. It's a complete schizophrenia. But at the same time, I think that, well, the FSB is, of course, it's, there's no mechanism of control, even not, we are talking not only about public control, about parliamentary control, and it was admitted openly by the chief of the Committee of Security, Vasilyev, who said that there is no tools or there is no parliamentary control on the security services in Russia. The problem is that there is no system of control even provided by the Kremlin, because in the time of the Soviet Union, the KGB was under control of the Communist Party. And Communist Party has cells in every department, every division, every section, and the officers were party members. Now this system was collapsed in 1991, and there were some ideas to replace it with the Department of Self-Security. But in this case, you see the system is completely changed, because one thing is the system of external control, of party control. Another thing, another, is the system of internal control. And not surprisingly, all chiefs of such department inside of the FSB were accused of corruption, because nobody controlled them. And the FSB was given the task to control other security services, and the Interior Ministry now, for example, the chief of the Ministry of Interior is the general of the FSB, former general, or maybe not former. We don't know for sure. And that's the question. But to be frank, I think the situation is more complicated, because in fact, we have another situation when, for example, population needed democracy, wanted democracy, and then from somewhere just appeared a group of people, corrupted, totalitarian, and started to rule the country. No, it's not the case. Now, in fact, the state bureaucracy and oligarchs, they needed to change the rules in the late 1990s, and they needed to more authoritarian things. They understood that we need to replace the idea of competition in media. You remember in 1990s they used media to fight each other. Then they decided that it's better and might be more effective to have the system completely secret, completely closed, and unpenetrable. And now they have this fighting but inside, and they are not interested in leaking information to the press, and they are not interested in media at all. At the same time, low-level and middle-level businessmen, they were interested, to be frank, in solving their problems with partners, using mafia first. And here I completely agree with Misha Glenny arguments that mafia was so popular in Russia in the 1990s because businessmen were interested to use mafia to solve their problems, to solve their disputes, because nobody believed in cows. And in the 2000s, when they understood that the FSB and law enforcement might be more effective to solve the same problems, because in this case you might not just kill people, or because it might be dangerous, and not just sue them in court, but you might send the guy to the jail for 20 years. Wow, it might be a very effective economic mechanism. So that's why now we have the system.
What you're saying is that effectively the secret police took over the private business of the mafia, in the same way that the state took over all these different companies.
Yeah, but the problem is that, in fact, we don't see the situation that, for example, the FSB controls corporations. For example, there is no it's incomparable with the situation in Egypt when Egyptian army controls the whole industries in country. We don't have these things in Russia. We have some generals, but mostly they are used as mercenaries by big businesses. And when you told, for example,
have an FSB guy sitting on the board.
Yeah.
And he's responsible for
and maybe we have some good connection inside the FSB. Yeah, protection, or just protection of some good business, or some deals with some concurrents and competitors. So that's why we cannot say that the FSB took over the country. What you said that was very correct. They were given the power. They were given the power by the oligarchs. And when we were talking about Putin friends, again, if you look at, for example, the biggest oligarchs figures, we have the same guys from the 1990s. The same Oleg Perov, the same, except Khodorkovsky, of course. But people in all industries, they are just the same. We have new guys like Kovalchuk and all these guys, but in fact, the biggest industries, metallurgical things, oil and gas, are controlled by the same people. They just decided that now the FSB and the law enforcement might be more suitable to use for solve their problems.
Susan, I wanted to ask you about the Russians as a whole. I mean, talk about oligarchs and journalists and international intrigue. How does the politics of Russia, the corruption, the kleptocracy, the mafia, the pervasive influence of the FSB, how does it actually play out in people's everyday lives? I mean, it always struck me that there are sort of two parallel stories in every country, and it's more extreme in Russia. There's this sort of day-to-day story of this politician's up, this politician's down, there's a bomb here, there's a bomb there, but at the same time, this kind of people are maybe getting generally richer or generally poorer or more cynical, as you said. I mean, how does this played out for ordinary Russians, do you think?
Well, the most immediate thing which you see is that since 2005, this massive gap has just got wider and wider between the elite and its service operations and the rest of Russians. And the elite just goes on cornering more and more of the assets. And the rest of Russians really are back in the same kind of problems that they had in the 90s of making ends meet. I mean, it's the people with whom I consort have real difficulties, and the enterprising, the small businessmen, and so on are more or less okay while they're not very successful, because nobody's interested in their lack of wealth. But as soon as they start to get anywhere, then they find that their advancement is absolutely blocked by corrupt officialdom at every level. And they face the problem of either they're going to join the system or they're going to sort of play Robin Hood with it, when they're not going to win because all the cards are stacked against them. And that's the point where they tend to take to drink.
I mean, the thing that shocked me in my last visits to Russia last year were how outside Moscow little has changed in terms of investment in roads, in infrastructure, in buildings, in schools. It just looks the same, and people are still poor. I mean, it's so obvious that the concentration of money in Moscow.
But on the contrary, actually things have changed dramatically, because in Soviet days, you used to go to small towns and there'd be, culture centres, and there'd be, doctors, there'd be all the things, and there would be, acting troupes who'd come and singers who'd come, and it was, life was quite pleasant in a sort of limited way. Now, there are villages which are just, as Luke describes going to one such village, the depopulation is just absolutely is really poignant. I mean, just a few old ladies and the men having drunk themselves to death or committed suicide. But
next thing you'll be pining for the good old days of Brezhnev.
Well, no, they've got the days. Brezhnev Mark II is really what sort of seems to me to be settling in now, isn't it?
But it's true that the sort of slow change of culture and education and health, it's much more sort of subtle and harder to see what's degrading and what's improving, if anything.
But the mood has between the early 2000s and the later 2000s is radically different. I mean, you found even people who had been, very sort of democratic and radical in the early 90s and during Perestroika period, they were really enthusiastic about Putin, genuinely, and I mean, to an extent which kept on taking me aback, that just you don't find it anywhere.
I was wondering, can I ask Angus a question?
Yes, by all means. Yes, by all means, go ahead.
I just had a quick question for Angus, which is that, unlike me, Angus has been on the inside and kind of worked for the Kremlin, help them with their kind of PR campaign. But I just wondered do the people at the top of Russian state, do they sort of see themselves as kind of enlightened absolutists who are trying to do the best for Russia but using kind of non-democratic methods? Is that their mission? Or I mean, do they have any kind of ideology, or is it for them just some kind of cynical postmodern game where they're in power and that's it? I mean, did you get what do they believe in this way? Yeah.
I should just explain that from 2006 for 3 years I took a little break from journalism and worked as an advisor to Putin's spokesman as part of the Western consortium that was advising them. And actually it was extraordinary, the view that they have of Western journalists and how they think they can be manipulated. They came to us clearly believing that they could literally buy good coverage in the Western press. You know, that a positive editorial in the Wall Street Journal had a price, and we should be paying for it, and that's how we should.
How much was it?
I can't remember. 100,000 or something. And so we had to disabuse them of that from the very start. And they nonetheless thought that our job should be to really manipulate journalists. You know, it wasn't enough just to set up an interview, let's say, with a Russian politician. We should follow it up and make sure that the journalists cover it in the correct way. And that was, you know, it was very difficult to persuade them that this just wasn't done in the West. And basically our role boiled down to advising them that what they needed to do most of all was just get on good terms with the Moscow correspondents, to schmooze with them. That's what Western government spokespeople do. You know, take them out for lunch, get to know them, and gradually influence them if you can.
Do you think you had any impact?
For a short while, for the first few months during the summer of 2006, it did work.
It was about 5 minutes. The charm face. I was invited to one briefing, and then it was kind of.
Well, how did you?
I tell you what happened after the Politkovskaya murder. They just got scared because they knew that whatever the nominal topic of a briefing would be, the questions would be about Politkovskaya and then Litvinenko and so on, and they just decided it's safer not to bother holding these briefings at all.
But how did you justify it yourself, working for them?
I got a lot of insight from my book.
But I mean, did you ever? Do you still have?
I had terrible qualms doing
concerns.
it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But as I say, it was interesting, and I did for a while harbour the illusion that I might be able to change them in some way, and realised, of course, that it was impossible. My friend, as you put it, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, let slip on television the other day that not everything under Brezhnev was bad. In fact, that Brezhnev, on the whole, was a big plus for Russia. So that lets you see where Putin's going. He's not just a spokesman for Putin. He's a clone of Putin, it seems to me.
We have seen this year some extraordinary events in the Middle East, and in the same way that nobody really predicted that the Soviet Union was going to fall apart so quickly, nobody really predicted the Arab Spring, as it's called. And if somebody had seen it coming, I don't think they would have picked Tunisia as the place it would start. One of the things about being a correspondent in Moscow is that somehow, as soon as you're in place in that office, after about a week, you're expected to be some kind of prophet and start telling people how things are going to play out. So, Luke, I mean, what's going to happen? Are we in for 14 years of stagnation under Putin too?
Yeah, well, I can say.
Or is there going to be something? Can you see the stirrings of something?
Well, I can say with certainty that the Guardian's dreadful office in Moscow, where James and I both work, will continue.
It's still the same one.
Yeah,
it's funny. I didn't recognise it from your description.
It's like
much nicer.
It's a sort of Soviet kind of two flats that have been kind of bodged into one with very low ceilings, no light, kind of dust everywhere. Newspapers which you never cleared out, you know, still there in the loo in the bathroom, and that won't change. And I suspect actually, I mean. It's funny you say this because I spent 3 weeks in Libya covering the fall of Tripoli and advancing with the rebels up from Zawiya through Sabratha and then to Tripoli. And you know, a year ago, who would have said that Gaddafi would have been defenestrated and then executed last Thursday? That seemed unlikely, but I don't know. I mean. I find it very hard to be optimistic about Russia, and partly obviously because of what happened to me, but partly because however bad it is, it's clearly less bad than it was sort of 30 years ago, and there just seems to be, first of all, a lot. I mean, despite the blogosphere and despite the younger generation, a lot of Russians are just they just don't care about politics. I mean, they're not. I don't sense any revolutionary mood. They seem to have sort of switched off, and almost part of the deal with the whole sort of Putin compact, if you like, is that. And why he's so clever is that private space in Russia is private. And Putin's great genius is to work out that you don't need to control all aspects of life. You don't need to do the totalitarian thing. You just need to control public space. So he has zombie TV, and he controls most of public space, but with some sort of safety outlets. But privately, people can do what they like, so that they can get a bit richer. They can go on holiday to Turkey. They can sleep with their neighbor, or have affairs, or they can do all that stuff as long as they don't challenge the state or infringe these rules. And I just think the system is a very clever postmodern authoritarian system, and it's much more subtle than the Gaddafi system or what we've seen in North Africa. And so my expectation is this: it could go on for some time. I mean, 3 years, 6 years, 9 years, 12 years. I mean, I do think eventually it will collapse. I mean, how many facelifts can Putin have before? I mean, but how did the Brezhnev era end? Well, he died and he was carried out horizontally from office after 18 years, and I really fear that at the moment that is the most likely scenario for Russia: another long period of Putin hegemony, followed by him falling off his horse.
But look, there's one thing which I wouldn't agree with there. Although people's heads are much, much freer, materially, the people outside these circles, the elites and their support structures, are much, much worse off than they ever were in Soviet times.
Sure.
And that is a really substantial fact. I mean, at some stage, that is going to play in.
Just one other thing, just to briefly come back, is that I think actually the key question here is the Caucasus. I think having been in the South, in the North Caucasus a lot, and having been to Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia, that there is really a big building, largely unreported civil war there, which is no longer a kind of regional conflict, but it is actually threatening to kind of engulf Russia existentially. And I think if there is a spark which ignites things and leads to regime change, I think it may well come from the Caucasus.
Andrei, there used to be this very cheerful theory amongst certain people in Russia in the 1990s that the mafia bosses were very rough and tumble, and it was kind of crazy capitalism, and then they'd send their children to Harvard. It was always Harvard for some reason, and they would become civilized, and Russia would be better. I don't know why people think sending children to Harvard makes them better behaved. I think it was people from Harvard who usually came up with this theory. Still, there is going to be a new generation. There is going to be this question of who gets the oligarchs' money. If you've got some big FSB general who's the head of this complicated family structure of friends and brothers-in-law and wives and mistresses and children, somehow the wealth has got to be transferred. Do you think there's any possibility that kind of mechanism might be transforming Russia?
I think, to be frank, it's the most crucial question now, and maybe this is the biggest reason why people became so angry now in Russia after this announcement about Putin. Because, to be frank, what Putin constructed, he had constructed the system that might last only for 10 years. For example, all chiefs of security services in Russia were chosen by Putin, and were chosen by his own age. So now they're all approaching 60. So they should be, they are in a very strange position now, because they're all dependent on presidential decree, and so their service might be prolonged, it might be not, and the situation is frozen in security services. At the same time, for example, in the 2005, 2006, the prominent FSB generals were given lands on Rublovka area, and this is the most expensive, most luxury area around Moscow. But the problem is that in the Soviet times, the system of motivation was that you might be given this land only temporarily, only in the time of your service. The problem is that this land were given to these particular generals. Now these generals, most of them are retired, and there is no other land left for the next generation. And these people started.
It's a classic story of succession from one generation to another.
Yeah,
there's not enough land.
Yeah, there was not enough land. And another problem is that state bureaucracy became very angry about Putin, because they think now, they say openly, frankly to me, that, well, we are deprived of our future because there would be no promotion. We get the same people for another 12 years, and so what we have to do? If I'm chief of department, I would be chief of department for the last of my days on the service. So if in my 40s, my career is just finished. And so, to be frank, the most unstable element now in Russia is state bureaucracy and businesses. Because for business, again, these people started to be very angry and very tired of relatives of Putin, relatives of the friends of relatives of the friends, blah, 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 because these people occupied all positions, all big business, and there is no hope for change. These people just sitting there, just the same people we got in the early 2000s or the next generation in the early 2000s, and that's all. There is no way to change them, to replace them by anyone. Anyway.
We're going to go to the audience for questions in a minute, so I hope you've all got some questions ready. But I just want to ask Susan quickly. You seem to be have a sense that something is building. Would that be putting it too far? Do you think that there is the chance of change coming in an uncontrolled way from the anger of the people?
I think that the model of the Arab Spring is not an impossible one, but let's hope that it will go in the different direction, which is that that if this younger generation does start to, what we need to hope doesn't happen is the revolt, because that just gets crushed and you have more of the same. If people start insisting on, if the rule of law becomes something which more people are working towards, then already business contracts are. Westerners can rely on business contracts actually working much better than they did before, and if this rule of law can start to spill over into the civil sphere, then yes, then something might change.
It was quite hard for you to say that, wasn't it? I don't see the peaceful succession mechanism. That's the problem. I just don't see that there is no peaceful succession mechanism.
I think we can only. It's going to be the unexpected.
Sure.
You can't.
I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions. I should say that the last time I came to an event about Russia in this place, the first person to ask a question was a few months later dead from drinking polonium-laced tea. So be careful what you say. If there's anyone in the audience from the FSB, then feel free to introduce yourselves and state your case.
Thank you very much for that interesting overview, and I'm not sure many of us who haven't either worked or lived in Russia would appreciate the turmoil you've been through. The question I guess I have is how all of this plays out from a governmental foreign policy standpoint, because I think that's one of the areas that is most frightening to me is the seeming unreliability of them as an ally to the West, and taking advantage of the weaknesses that the West has, and particularly the States, in the Middle East now with all the turmoil that's going on. So how do you see the evolution of their foreign policy, and what impact is the result of your experience is going to be?
Yeah, just briefly, it's a good question. I think Russia's foreign policy is, as I mentioned earlier, it's basically this kind of historical mission to have a kind of, a big Russia, a powerful Russia, and a Russia that the US above all takes seriously. But I think what's been pretty dismaying actually for human rights activists and for people who take, you could say, a more kind of moralist view of Russia is this kind of reset. Between the US and the Kremlin, because it's and the Obama administration's attempts to mend relations with Moscow after the disaster of the late Bush era, and in particular the Russian-Georgian War in 2008. But reading through the WikiLeaks cables, that they kind of bet the house on Dmitry Medvedev. There's all sorts of stuff about how Medvedev represents progressive forces inside the Kremlin, and how he has to be the primary interlocutor for the US. I covered Obama's visit when he met Medvedev, which was hilarious in itself, because Obama's very tall and Medvedev is like this, really the smallest world leader I've ever seen. He looked like a little schoolboy coming up to collect a form prize or something. But that didn't work out. To be fair to the US State Department, they also recognized that Putin was the main guy. But I think this reset with Russia hasn't really worked, and we're seeing increasing problems, specifically over this Sergei Magnitsky law, this visa ban, which is going through Congress at the moment for Russian officials involved in basically the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, this lawyer from Hermitage Capital, and the Russians sort of coming up with their own sort of reciprocal gesture. But I think it's a big problem because Putin's been very astute in his foreign policy. He's played the US well. He's divided the Europeans. He's bought Silvio Berlusconi. He's kind of co-opted the Germans. He's hired Gerhard Schröder. And he's isolated the guys from the Baltics and been extremely rude to the British, snubbing them and then, receiving David Cameron, but basically, telling him to piss off. So I think it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge.
But I mean, Angus, don't the Russians have a very old-fashioned view of the world that they're harking back to to 20 years ago? And that particularly as we're seeing now that Europe and America are starting to fade, and they don't really understand that China and India and Brazil are kind of leaving them for dust, really.
What I would say is that I think almost any Russian leader will run a pretty similar foreign policy. Whether it's Medvedev or Putin or even one of the sort of opposition figures who we think of as pro-Western, all of them, when they come to power, are going to defend Russia's interests. They have to. That's what they're there for.
Sure.
And Russian foreign policy has tended for the past 20 years to be essentially reactive. They don't come up with many initiatives of their own. They react to the outside world, and in particular, Putin reacted to George W. Bush's foreign policies, which, in my view, were as disastrous towards Russia as they were towards Iraq and the rest of the world. In the work that we did on the documentaries and the book, where we interviewed a lot of Western politicians as well as senior Russians, we discovered that Putin, when he came to power, was very keen to reset relations with the West, and the first person he approached was George Robertson, then Secretary General of NATO, and told him that he wanted a fresh start, despite the fact that they were pissed off with NATO's recent bombing of Kosovo and Serbia and so on. He wanted a new start in relations. He even virtually suggested that they should consider taking Russia as a member of NATO, which obviously was impossible, but that was and
his first visit was here to London.
It was, yes.
I think
Bush responded to these sort of overtures. We all know that Putin also, made the gesture of calling Bush and offering help with Afghanistan immediately after 9/11 and so on. Bush insisted on abandoning the anti-ballistic missile treaty so that he could build a new Star Wars missile defense system. Putin was very much against that, but acquiesced in it because he still wanted his relationship with Bush to succeed. Bush, however, pushed ahead with the expansion of NATO right up to Russia's borders, which, rightly or wrongly, Russia's leaders believe they had been promised this would never happen. They say that Gorbachev had been told it would never happen. It has. And since Putin, I think, is essentially a paranoid man, he believes that the expansion of NATO up to Russia's borders, the creation of a missile defense shield, even if allegedly it's aimed against North Korea and Iran, looks very much as if it could be used against Russia as well, considering they were going to base it in Poland and the Czech Republic. All these things spooked Putin, and as I say, his retreating into isolationism, I think, is very much a reaction to George Bush's policies.
Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I just would like to back that up and say that you say spooked Putin, but that was that was triggering something very profound in the Russian psyche. This fear of encirclement, the paranoia about them. Different thems historically at different moments, but them encircling us, and it's obvious when you look at the geography of this country without clear borders that paranoia is going to be endemic, and so basically we, the West, in the form of Bush, we went out of our way both to renege on our commitments and to provoke in the way that we knew would get this to let a cat out of the bag, which we now can't put back in.
I do want to give as much time as possible for questions, so unless you have a...
No, just one thought, but I totally agree with you that the politics and foreign policy is mostly about reaction. Because, for example, Russia pressured Poland when shale gas is discovered, and Russia just found itself in the center of the crisis. They needed to react somehow. They started to build new relations with Poland. They dismissed completely what they'd done before it. It always happened when something, for example, what you say about the early 2000s, when the Orange revolutions, and again reaction. What we need to do. Arab Spring, again reaction about Libya. So it's always about reaction. It's always about tactics, but not about strategy. There is no strategy at all. So that's why it's very difficult to predict what might be the next step. Because it would be just a reaction to the next crisis.
Next question.
I just want to thank you all again for an interesting speech tonight. I actually grew up on the journalism of Luke and James, and it's actually sort of led me to becoming I'm a journalist. Just started off as a financial journalist. And I just wanted to ask you about something looking forward, really. I've just come out of journalism school, and we've been taught a lot about how citizen journalism is changing the whole scene. And we've talked about the Arab Spring in China. You've got the government clamping down on Twitter, sort of Weibo. And what I'm interested in is, do you think there's room for optimism in Russian journalism? Looking at the likes of Alexander Navalny, taking a minor stakeholder in large companies, is there room for a greater press freedom through citizen journalism?
Well, I'd like Luke and Susan to answer that, if you may.
I'll be very brief. This has been quite an amusing week for me. I now have, I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I have 21 Twitter clones tweeting Dmitry Medvedev press releases. They've got my photo, they've got my bio, but they're tweeting kind of pro-badminton propaganda at the moment, which is...
you didn't like badminton, did you?
No. While I would say, briefly, there is plenty of room for optimism. I mean, the blogosphere, Navalny, his stuff is clearly, there's clearly a real conversation going on there, which is kind of great. But also, like I said before, this is a clever regime, and they've wised up to Twitter and Facebook and everything else, and they're also using it as a way to attack and discredit regime critics, whether they're in the West or in Russia. So whenever I write an article for The Guardian about Russia, the first 40 comments say, Luke Harding is a spy who takes money from, it's just this avalanche of abuse and kind of ad hominem hatred, which is not, well, I don't think it's spontaneous, but it looks to me like it's systemic. So yeah, basically positive, but with some darkness too.
Susan?
I think there are moderate grounds for being optimistic. I mean, take something like the last summer's fires was a very good example of when the internet started to become be used in sort of civic ways to start to counter these forest fires, or you see it in environmental movement on specific issues. It's become quite powerful and effective, but there are definitely limits, and I think that Andrei.
Well, I was going to say to Andrei, I mean, this book, which is pretty harsh and critical and probing, and most terrible of all, factual, about the FSB, is actually published in Russia, not without difficulty. But could you just maybe talk a little bit about the strange sort of state of censorship, not censorship, self-censorship, which exists in Russia? Some things you can say, some things you can't. You don't know what you're allowed to say.
Well, the problem is that the pressure is not so direct. It's not that the guy from the Kremlin called the editor and asked him to dismiss some journalists. The problem is that there's many angles of this problem. That, for example, the investigative journalism was mostly compromised in 1990s and late 1990s, because many prominent journalists they accepted some money, and these stories were exploited by the Kremlin. For example, we had a lot of TV serials when the good guy from the police saved corrupt journalist who was killed or maybe about to be killed. And people started, the attitude to journalists completely changed in the early 2000s. I started to work as a journalist in 1996, and well, it was one thing to be a journalist then, and another thing to be a journalist in 2005, for example. When I get to the flat with some friends and some people who are not journalists, the usual first phrase would be, "Well, you're a journalist, maybe I can pay you $200, you might publish a story about me." So that's to be frank, it's become very, very difficult, and as a result, and maybe as an excuse, editors started to dismiss and to close down the investigative departments. Now we have in Moscow only 2 investigative departments numbered 3 and 2 people, And I was forced, for 10 years, I was forced to leave 5 publications. And this book is a result of one of the firing, because I was fired from Novaya Gazeta. So even Novaya Gazeta now, well, in a very difficult situation, and they cannot publish the story about the FSB. And it was a desperate attack, to be frank. I wanted to get my book published, and to get my book published in Russian, I needed to find an American publisher to propose him to write this book, and I was forced to, but asked to write this book in English. So the book was first published in the United States, then after the year it was published in Russian in July. And immediately after some weeks we get some problems with the FSB, because the FSB approached the printing house, requesting information about who actually ordered the printing of the book. So you see, it might be quite annoying, and well, it's not, the problem is...
But it did come out.
Yes, but the problem is that very few people now ready to do this kind of thing, because, well, one thing, if you are just summoned on interrogation, you might make this story public, my colleagues might support you, and this story might be publicized, and you might be protected in this way. Another thing, and if you are just, if your editor decide that they don't need investigative department anymore and your paper, and in this case, the pressure might be economic, and, well, in this case, you cannot blame the Kremlin, and you just found yourself without job, without anything to do. And many journalists who were very good in the 1990s, now they are PR managers, or they just leave the profession.
Anyone else? Yes.
You have a Russian publisher for your book?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Luke mentioned the Caucasus, and I was thinking back to the paralysis of the final years of Brezhnev and the way in which Afghanistan kind of pushed things over the edge. Nobody believed that anything was going to happen, and Afghanistan had a crucial role in changing that. And I wondered whether the Caucasus and what may be happening on the southern borders of Russia might actually have an equivalent effect in disturbing what seems at the moment to be 18 coming years of paralysis under Putin.
Yeah, I mean, one of the stories I write about are the bombings on the Moscow metro, and they were kind of two women bombers from Dagestan who blew themselves up and killed about 50 people. And I went to interview the father and the family of one of the women bombers from Dagestan, who turned out to be highly educated, a computer specialist, the only person from her region to get 2 degrees, and really didn't kind of fit the profile of this sort of classic Chechen, black widow who'd been abused and so on. And what became clear from that trip was that there's a new radicalized generation without the Soviet heritage of their parents who are prepared to kind of wage jihad against the Russian state, if you like, and also that from the Kremlin there was no creative thinking whatsoever about the Caucasus. I mean, their counterterrorism strategy is simply in the case of Chechnya, to kind of delegate everything to Kadyrov, so Kadyrov can kind of sort the problem out by rounding up people and killing them, and by this kind of totally counterproductive cycle of sweep operations and so on. And I think the issue is the fact that what's essentially been a regional conflict is now spilling into Moscow. We had the metro bombings, and then we had the airport bombing at Domodedovo, and these new jihadists who are very web savvy, quite organised, have got a new kind of capacity to hit urban targets in European Russia. So I think it's an enormous problem. But whether this is the thing that pushes the Putin state over, I don't know.
Well, Andrei, I mean, I'm interested in what you think about this, because what Luke says, the dangers for the state of the Caucasus, makes a lot of sense. But from the very first time that I first started looking at the Caucasus in the early 90s and to what I read now, there's been this little kind of subtext that runs along that actually the mysterious people who pull the strings in Russia, they actually like having a small war going on. It allows them, on the one hand, it allows them to make money. On the other hand, it enables them to put in place extreme measures at convenience. Do you think there's any value in that, or is it just?
No, I don't. To be frank, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. I see that Putin tried and Medvedev tried to find some right person who might do something with the North Caucasus, and found this guy Chlaponian, and he was completely useless because there is no way to do anything with Kadyrov, because Kadyrov is protected personally by Putin. I think the problem is here that we have in the whole country we have the problem with social lift. There is no space for young generation. But in the North Caucasus, because in the North Caucasus the system is completely corrupt because of all these family ties and all these things. So the situation seems to be worse. And there is no space for them, there is no work for these people, and these people are so desperate they find only one way to do something in their life. They try to go to the forest and to do something. It's not about religion, it's not about Islam, it's something about we need to find their place in life, to be frank. And because they're so brutally prosecuted by the force, and every family suffered, almost every family. And there's a big gap between for example, now we have the situation when law enforcement and Islamists, they even are from different class, from different families. They are not intercepted. There is no connection between them. They don't understand each other. It's completely different tribes. And well, in this case, because there is no way to do something peacefully, we go to the forest.
The whole ethnic dimension, Angus, was very much a live issue in the 1990s. I mean, people talked not just about Chechnya and Dagestan, but people talked about Tatarstan. And of course there are these many minorities, and they have their own political structures and sort of semi-independencies. Yeah. From what you've been researching recently, do you feel that this is something that the Kremlin is worried about, or do you think we've sorted that, it's over?
No, they don't, and I think that's the rationale behind what they're doing in Chechnya. I mean, they're terrified of separatism like that spreading to other parts of Russia. But I mean, I would say that this is a problem that the Russians, first Yeltsin and then Putin, have brought upon themselves. It was a problem that scarcely existed in the early 1990s. I remember visiting Chechnya in the year before Yeltsin sent in troops to squash the independence bid there. Okay, Dudayev was a crazy man leading their independence bid there, but there was no religious element to it. It was a secular country. All they wanted was to be free from Russia, which they tried to do. They used to say every 50 years we've had an uprising to throw the Russians out, and they wanted to do it again. Everything in Chechnya is different language, different religion, different culture, the lot. But it wasn't, at that point, a jihadist movement at all. That only happened after the Russians went in and kindled a new sense of identity in the Chechen people, and then in the Dagestani nation and so on, which manifested itself in this new jihadist Islamic movement. And it's going to haunt the Russians for years to come.
Susan, do you see that perhaps the ethnic question in Russia could be the spark that sort of sets something off?
Yes, but I don't see that as being something that could turn out for the better. I mean, I think that's a gloomy, and that's the worst case scenario. And I mean, I was just having a conversation with somebody in the audience, Oliver Bullock, who knows a lot about that part of the world, and I was saying that one of the changes is that the nationalists now would be heartily pleased, the Russian nationalists, to be free of Chechnya. Would that be a good thing? And Oliver, who might like to talk about this, was saying absolutely no. It would be a disaster for the North Caucasus. Would you agree with that, Andrea?
Well, we have now a very peculiar process. When Russian nationalists started to try to find a way how to cooperate with the nationalists in the North Caucasus, the FSB became very afraid of it, because there's some rumors that some people in nationalistic circles are supplied with weapons by people from the North Caucasus. Because now the idea of nationalism in Russia is not to attack us, for example, 5 years ago, attack Central Asian migrants or North Caucasian people, but to attack police, to attack the state, because the state constructed this strange system of the society when we have so many migrants, blah blah blah. So now we have a common enemy, and I know that my friend my sources from the FSB told me that when they interrogated some nationalists, the usual first question was, so if you're a nationalist, why you don't go to Chechnya and you're not fighting there? And always the response was only one, but we have a common enemy, now you are our enemy, and afterward, when we destroy you, we might decide what to do with the North Caucasus.
Anyone else? Yes. Yes, madam. If we can get or is the microphone in the wrong place?
I've got one over here, if I can ask.
Oh, right, if somebody's already got a
Actually,
microphone.
I've got a question for Andrei. Just wondering, you've been writing about the FSB for a decade, and you've written this brilliant book about it. Do you think that the terrible problems that Luke suffered, is that an exception, or is he just the only person who's been brave enough to write about it?
Well, I had my own experience. I was mostly the FSB used against me and my colleague Irina Baragan, because we worked together and we wrote this book together. Mostly we use interrogation. They summoned us to Lefortovo. They, under pretext of the criminal investigation of maybe they reveal some state secret, and that was the pretext to. In Russia, according to law, you need a kind of legal pretext to start so-called operational measures. That means surveillance technologies, all these things. So they open something on us, and because we are Russian national, so they can open the case, then we can start with operational measures, and we might be followed. But the problem is for us always, because maybe it's my old habits, because I started to work as a journalist in crime department. But you need to be well. You know, in crime departments there is always talk about surveillance, and the usual response is you need to work on. You need to forget about. Well, one thing is to think about surveillance. Another thing is to work. So you need to choose, because it's very easy to become paranoid, and very easily you might spend all your time thinking about are you followed or not. So I'm not professional in this case. I think these guys are professional, so they do their job. I cannot understand. I cannot do this job better than these people. So mostly my response is just to forget about these things, not to think follow time, not today or tomorrow. Is there any people here in this audience from the FSB? Because it's just blow my brain. So it's better just to do your job and to forget about these things. So that's why I think. Well, this is my response to it.
Sort of hints and sometimes direct comments in your book about how some of your colleagues in Moscow were not all that supportive of your position. I mean, I'm not asking you to name names, but that must be must have been disappointing for you. Shall we say?
There's a whole area of pain. Just to say about whether just to answer your question about whether I suffered more. I mean, I think I did because of the stupid Berezovsky thing, but I do know of about between 4 and 6 other friends of mine who are correspondents in Moscow who've also suffered from break-ins, normally on one occasion or possibly 2 occasions. But the problem is you have to decide when to write about it. And in my case, even though the British government knew about it, the British embassy knew about it, and at one point I had to kind of fly back to London because it was so bad. I didn't actually write about it until after I left. So, I could have written about it in Moscow, but I think that would have just made it worse. But other people being bitchy, I don't know. I mean, I have a couple of paragraphs in the book about a kind of culture of timidity among Western correspondents, and I've been kind of roundly criticised for including that. But I also kind of pay tribute in the book to the bravery and courage and integrity of a whole heap of reporters in Russia, especially Russian ones, and not just in Moscow but also in the provinces, because what happened to me was, was VIP treatment. If you compare what happened to Polikovskaya to Russian journalists, the rules are entirely different. I mean, if you're a British journalist, you can be bullied, but that's it. Whereas if you're a Russian journalist, you can be killed.
Look, if I may ask you the question, what I can't understand is, when I was summoned for interrogation, our usual tactics was to make it public, because it's the only protection for you. As far as I understand, I had not chance to read your book, but as far as I understand, you were summoned to interrogation to Lefortovo. So, but as far as I understand, you decided to make it public only now. So, why you decided not to write about it, And to be frank, I don't understand why you decided to go to this interrogation, because I'm as a Russian citizen, I'm obliged to go to interrogation because I'm Russian national. So why foreign journalists should go to be interrogated by the FSB to Lefortovo? I just to keep silence.
You mean not turn up and keep quiet about it?
Yeah, because they usually, the FSB tactic is usually, if you keep silence, they understand it, they consider it as kind of invitation for the game. after that, they just think
Well,
about
the
what might be
yeah.
the pressing point for you.
The problem is, Andrew, I hadn't read your wonderful book, and I didn't know what the rules were. And this was part of the problem. Is that now I feel I've actually been in the KGB handbook, and I could write it myself. I've kind of experienced it directly. But back then, I didn't know what the game was. And one of the things in my book is almost to try and find the vocabulary to explain this. So I learned Russian words like demonstrativna sleshka, for anyone who speaks Russian, or proslушиваться, to be listened to, and German words like Zersetzung, which is what the Stasi called these psychological operations, which were applied to me. So, I mean,
did you get the impression they were surprised to see you when you turned up at Lefortovo?
Well, I mean, the thing was, I did say to them, look, I really don't want to talk to you, and besides, my role in this drama was this Berezovsky drama was absolutely trivial. But the answer was, no, you will come and see us, and you will bring a criminal lawyer. So at that point, I just relayed back to London, this is the situation. And the view, which may have been the wrong view, but the view from my editor at the time was, go along, because otherwise it's going to antagonize them further. Had I known that this meant game on, obviously I wouldn't have showed, but I didn't know. And in a sense, this is why this whole thing is so disempowering, because it's just like turning up and then, it's a party, you don't know anybody, and someone immediately punches you in the face, you just don't.
But you did get to describe the inside of Lefortovo prison, so that was
well, I mean, that was a bonus. It was for anyone who's seen the Lives of Others, the wonderful German film about the Stasi by Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck. It was exactly like that. It was astonishing. And the strange thing was, actually, I did write about it. I just merely didn't publish. I can still vividly recall going inside. I mean, with this lawyer, I went into the reception room, the FSB reception room in Lefortovo, and there are no chairs or sofas, so you have to stand. It's completely empty. And then there's this sort of silver mirrored thing where the guy on the other side can see you, but you can't see him. And I just saw this hand came through to take my phone and passport. It was a terribly hairy hand, so I'm staring at this hairy hand, then escorted up to room 305 through this anonymous corridor of totally identical rooms. And I have to say, in my head, I was kind of filmically recording every scene. And then the other thing I describe in the book is this glass, which I think you picked up on, where the young major, there's a bottle of fizzy water and there's a glass, and on it is written Cheka, Ogpu, KGB, FSB. And I was staring at this glass. It's like, there's the Czechists, that's the KGB, I know about them, Ogpu, the forerunner of the KGB, and so on. And it seemed to me that this was clearly some kind of brotherhood. This was some kind of sect. This was, I don't know. But I mean, I can vividly recall every frame of that. And I did write about it. And the problem was my notes disappeared. They stole my notes during one of the break-ins. I'd written all this stuff down and it vanished. So I had to rewrite it. But yeah, we probably should have published it at the time.
But the bit which really gives an insight is when you go to what used to be to Berlin and track down the man who was running the Stasi intelligence. I can't remember exactly what his position was, but there, Luke, I'd like you to talk.
Well, no, just briefly. I mean, this was a fantastic moment because I was expelled in February, and then in March, just by coincidence, the Guardian pinged me to Berlin to do some Europe series, and there. I found out that basically I'd been told that the Stasi used this techniques, and I was given a name of someone called Jochen Gierke, who was the head of operational psychology at the Stasi's training academy in Potsdam, which also features in The Life of Others. So I met him in this rather nice bar in Friedrichstrasse in the center of Berlin, and he just walked me through it. He said, yes, we use the same methods, except we did it better than the Russians. They were no good. We made everything better than them, and took a real professional pride. And he said, we would break into someone's car and repark it in the same position, but with two wheels on the curb, sometimes we went into someone's flat and we would, above a dissident, we would break the water pipe, so water would come cascading down, and he would be swimming in water for 2 weeks and not do enemy activity, and the Stasi, being diligent, rather kind of po-faced Germans, they wrote 800-page theses about how these psychological tactics could be used against enemies. And what was fascinating was that, like Putin's Russia, the East Germans under Honecker from the 70s and 80s, they were smart. They realized that stringing people up by their thumbs and packing them off to gulags was bad publicity. So instead, they used these insidious psychological methods against all sorts of people, and it's all there in the Stasi archives. And they used it, for example, it was exported against the Soviet bloc. And talking to this guy, it was just this absolutely cathartic moment, because finally, I had an answer, because I had this fantasy in my head that maybe I'd find someone from the FSB who would explain this all to me, and of course it never happened. But by sort of slaloming over to East Germany, I kind of got the answer, which is all in the final chapter of the book. And the other glorious detail was who was in East Germany in the 1980s, second half of the 1980s, as a rather unsuccessful junior KGB spy. It was Vladimir Putin. And so what he's wheeled at is what he learned as a young KGB officer, and that really explains the modern Russian state.
I have a much more practical question. I wanted to ask, at what level does the mafia come in when you start a business with Russia? That is, like, so that to avoid it, like, at what level should we start?
Are you planning to start a business in Russia?
I'm sure Andrea's got something to say, but I would just say that in the direct experience of the young businessman I know, it's not the mafia at that level. It is corrupt bureaucracy, and and that's a very important difference. I mean, the bureaucracy is corrupt from the bottom up, you can go on for quite a bit before getting. But you actually have to be seen to be really worth it. You have to be a milk cow before it's worth their. They'll go for somebody fatter than you before they go for you, and so as long as you're unsuccessful, it's fine.
But to be frank, I think you would be approached by the law enforcement, not by the mafia. So that's a problem for you, because it's mafia. You might find another group. For example, in the 1990s, the question was to find another group of, I don't know, you might be protected by Chechens or might be by Slavian groups, and that was the case. Now the problem is you would be approached by law enforcement, and they might act according to the law, and you would be prosecuted according to the law, and it might be, to be frank, much worse. And what happened with Magnitsky, I think it's an obvious example.
Seems to me that the favourite method that the authorities use to extort money is to invent a problem which doesn't really exist and then extort money from you to make it go away. There was a well-known example recently where there's been a huge scandal in the procurement by the health ministry of CT scanners, very expensive pieces of equipment, and so the officials are demanding big kickbacks from the manufacturers of this equipment to take them to win the tender. And there were two guys in the Kremlin administration who've now been jailed for it. It's one small success against corruption, who had invented a blacklist of companies that weren't allowed to take part in the tender for selling equipment to the Russian state. And Toshiba was one of the companies that wanted to take part. And these two guys said to Toshiba, well, you're on this blacklist, but $1 million, we could take you off the blacklist. Toshiba reported this to the authorities and exceptionally actually had it investigated, and the two guys ended up in prison. So it's, but that's the way it seems to work.
Medvedev likes Toshiba. He likes the gadgets.
Yes.
Another question, sir.
Just quickly, it would appear that from what a lot of you guys have said, that he who controls the security infrastructure of Russia controls the state. And there was talk about the brotherhood and the connection from sort of Tsarist security services through to Soviet security services through to now that there's a lineage there. One could say that in Britain, to a certain extent, that he who controls Parliament controls the state, but Parliament has a legal identity. There's a building, there's a public tradition. If there is this FSB as it is now, what's it made of? Where do you find it, and what is it really?
I think you need to read that Andrei's book, but perhaps in just 2 minutes.
Just very briefly, you need to understand that the FSB is uncomparable with anything in the West because it's a very large structure. So, we have, if MI5 have, I don't know, 6,000 people, the FSB, according to some modest estimates, have more than 200,000 people. We have the central apparatus in Moscow, and in every Russian towns and in every regions we have special departments. So that's why there's the tensions between. It's not a monolith. It's a very amorphous structure, and there's internal tensions between, for example, mid-level officers and generals, between regions and Moscow. So that's why it's very difficult to describe. The problem is if you face particular officer, for example, in region, he might be more xenophobic, might be more inward-looking than the guy from the Moscow. But the guy from Moscow might be more corrupt. So that's that might be always depends on the situation, on the region, and on the level of the officer you faced with.
You do find that some regions are much more corrupt than others, too, depending on local leadership.
But it's explained by practical reasons. All regions that have borders, for example, with China, and of course people there are more corrupt because they see the way how to smuggle some things from China to Russia, and these regions are more and the structures, loan structures, because they are very far from Moscow and they are not controllable by even by the leadership in Moscow. They are more corrupt than people are in Moscow, for example.
So,
one thing that hasn't been mentioned tonight, which seems to be quite important to me, is the Communist Party. Is the FSB a Communist Party-shaped organisation? In other words, is it filling the role that the Communist Party once did? I mean, this was an extremely powerful organisation which disappeared overnight, and there must be a sociological impact of that. Hundreds of thousands, millions of members of the party which were running the country, and suddenly they disappear, and now you have the FSB, which you seem to be suggesting is running the country. Is it in the shape of the Communist Party?
Well, just briefly, I have to say that I don't think that we have to talk about communism and communist ideology after 1943.
I don't mean ideologically, I mean organization.
Organization, well, to be frank, yes, I think it's just disappeared. These people, because, well, I think might be at the moment in 1991, they were so glad that this control just disappeared. And this was the excuse and the reason why they become so kleptocratic, because they just feel that there is no control now, and these people just disappeared from off the radar, and they don't need to feel about party discipline now.
I mean, if you look at the CVs of important people in Russia and any part of the former Soviet Union, they often were members of the party and they're sort of important functionaries within it. But it's just part of their career.
Yeah, but I mean, also,
so they might still be thriving now in power.
It's kind of come back in the shape of United Russia. I mean, what Putin has done is he's kind of restored these various elements, and so Nashi, these sort of young thugs who go around and hound people. That's obviously like Komsomol, and the Communist Party is like Yedina Rossiya, the United Russia Party, but without the ideology and really without any talent whatsoever, as far as I can see.
Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I don't entirely agree with the idea that United Russia is like the Communist Party. I mean, the Communist Party was the Soviet state. It ran every element of the Soviet state. United Russia is a party that exists for Putin and nothing else. And I think when Putin goes, United Russia will collapse.
Sure, yeah.
But following on from what Angus said, that does mean that when communism fell, it was like a game of musical chairs. The music stopped, and therefore all these party people were in positions of, I had my factory, you had your, they had different assets, and those became effectively theirs when the music stopped. And so, yes, that was the new, a new elite was instantly formed.
Yes, I mean, if you had two things to do, one was to sit at a desk and hold party meetings, and the other one was to sell millions of barrels of oil overseas for huge amounts of money, then the choice is easy to make, it seems. So I think we're just about going to have to wrap this up, unfortunately, but this gentleman's been very patient at the back here. One last question.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I'll make it quick. My question is particularly for Mr. Soldatov, but for all of you, please. It's based on my service in a European Union mission in several law enforcement agencies in non-Soviet states in the last few years, but not in Russia. It's mainly based on Ukrainian experience, where I noticed that there was a lot of goodwill between the EU and particularly the the SBU in Ukraine, and a lot of those opportunities were missed by the West. And I think in my last visit back to Kiev a year ago, I think that's gone for a long time. You mentioned about tactics, they work tactically. Are there any particular tactical issues of mutual self-interest that could be pushed forward to try and reset to a certain extent with Russia? And following on from that point, on a rather more perhaps sinister or realpolitik basis, a question about the mysterious visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel to Moscow, I think in late 2009, where he appears to have got a deal to block the delivery of S-300 missiles to Iran. Nobody seems to have asked the question, what on earth did he have to give to Putin? Because that would have been at very highest levels to get that decision. And I have to say, I think there's some rather disturbing implications behind that.
Well, I'm not sure anyone here has to answer that.
I don't understand what the question is.
I think I'm not sure anyone on the panel is quite qualified to deal with that last point. But the first question seemed to be about was there an opportunity if the West had been a bit more nimble and flexible over the past few years to have a better relationship with the FSB?
Well, I think the biggest lost opportunity is that European values completely compromised in Russia, because all these stories about Schroeder, about Mendelssohn, about all these big officials, about Tony Blair, who decided to accept this position in Kazakhstan, I think, widely publicized in Russia, and with the same refrain that, well, you see these guys, they are talked about liberal values, about democracy, but they might be very easily bought. So we need just to propose some good money for it, and sometimes they are very successful. And there was an old idea of some dissidents and some positional politicians in the early 2000s that Russia is so totalitarian, so frightening that there is no friends to Russia. In fact, we see that something quite opposite. Italy, France, Germany are so pro-Russian in many cases, and they don't think that we need to talk about Chechen issues, for example. And we see even on the level of law enforcement, for example, we have a series of killings when the Russian secret services are accused of being part. But in fact, for example, many, as far as I know, in Austria, in France, in other countries, in Denmark, law enforcement started to be very in mood to cooperate with Russians. So they now Russian law enforcement, because they're so simplistic in how they understood the world, and they're, to be frank, very pro-Israeli, mostly not because of ideology, not because of some regional gain, but because they understand this kind of language, but brutal and simple language. And they think that they need just to find an approach to European countries that they are not so inclined to cooperate with Russia, that's all. They just don't buy all this talk about liberal values. They think it's completely compromised.
Luke, finally, you've gone face to face with these people, mano a mano.
Well, except I never actually quite saw them, but apart from in the Lefortovo, yeah.
I mean, do you feel that it's beyond the point of reasonable dialogue between Britain and America and Europe's security services and the...
Well, I mean, one thing we haven't talked about is we haven't talked about the Litvinenko case. You mentioned the first questioner was Litvinenko here, and the British, we're pretty kind of hopeless at most things, but I think on Russia, the British government's taken a principled stand, both the last Labour one, despite Tony Blair, and the current one, and this is the real sticking point in British-Russian relations, is that for the FSB and for Putin, the fact that David Miliband severed all cooperation in 2007 with the FSB in protest at the Kremlin's failure to extradite Andrei Lugovoy, I think is humiliating and still rankles. And until any British government reverses that, there's going to be no prospect of improved cooperation. And no, despite David Cameron going to Moscow, and alas, I have to say, no prospect of President Vladimir Putin visiting the UK anytime soon.
Well, maybe it's not all bad. Thanks very much for your wisdom and your thoughts. Thanks to the audience for coming along tonight. And £10 for this book.
It's a bargain.
And rush to Amazon for this. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.